It says a lot about the world at the moment, the way media, politics and mob behaviour plays out these days, that much of the world today was on tenterhooks waiting to see what the verdict would be in a murder case in Minnesota and what the reaction of the people would be to that verdict in the streets of the United States. We saw violent riots for much of last year, people killed, homes and businesses vandalised and buildings burned to the ground in Minneapolis, New York, Chicago, Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles, Atlanta and elsewhere. Much of the violence was perpetrated by Black Lives Matter protesters, Antifa or groups associated with them. Yet we've heard far more condemnation of the Capitol Hill riots by Donald Trump supporters in January than we have of the so-called race riots of last year. Yet we now know the rioters in Washington killed no one. Of the 5 deaths that day, 1 was a protester shot dead by police. 4 others, including a police officer, died from natural causes. So why the focus on that one riot and the excuses for the year of bloodshed in other cities on other issues? Is that because the cause or the side excuses the violence? Surely not. It certainly shouldn't be the case. Violence should always be condemned, just as peaceful protests should always be defended. Anyway, that's the great concern about the trial in Minneapolis, where former police officer Derek Chauvin was charged with the murder of convicted armed robber George Floyd. The worry here was that on top of a needless death during a routine arrest on a city street, we were seeing a threat to justice and the rule of law. Would the threats of violence and mob riots and the political statements about the case make it impossible to get a fair trial? Would a jury risk their own safety and grave consequences for the nation, even if they thought the charges were unproven? We may never know, but we do know there was palpable relief from many and celebrations from others when Chauvin was found guilty on all 3 counts.
Minneapolis police officer guilty on all 3 counts. 2nd-degree unintentional murder, guilty. 3rd-degree murder, guilty. 2nd-degree manslaughter, guilty. Derek Chauvin is now led away. While that verdict was read out, he did seem to remain unmoved. Outside the courthouse, you can see that there, tears and cheers, and that's where we find Annalise Nielsen. She's been covering this court case since its beginning.
Yeah, from this distance, I won't get into the evidence and the judgment, which is certain to be appealed anyway. But I will say that from what we've seen on that video endlessly for almost a year, we can see that whatever Floyd's previous crimes and whatever his actions and resistance on the day, he was mistreated, badly mistreated, in a callous way that eventually turned out to be deadly. No matter how tough policing is, no matter how much resistance police confront on the streets, we know they must treat all people with respect and with due care. That clearly did not happen to Floyd, and he should not have lost his life. It was a tragedy. But what we have to be wary of is the broader symbolism being built around this awful killing, especially by senior politicians.
Thank you, George Floyd, for sacrificing your life for justice, for being there to call out to your mom. How heartbreaking was that? Call out for your mom. I can't breathe. But because of you and because of thousands, millions of people around the world who came out for justice, your name will always be synonymous with justice.
Really? George Floyd should not have died. He is a victim. It was a tragic waste of life, and his murderer has now been convicted. But to make Floyd a martyr, well, here's Candace Owens.
And the idea of martyring George Floyd, the way Nancy Pelosi spoke about him, it completely forgives all of the trauma that he brought against his victims while he was alive. You know, a man that served 7+ stints in prison while he was alive, armed robbery being 2 of the reasons why, and now we're going to martyr him and say that your name will forever be synonymous with justice. Imagine, Tucker, if you are one of his victims that is alive, one of his victims that he armed robbed, and you have to hear that this man's name will always be synonymous with justice. How would that feel to you?
The trouble is that racial tensions, identity politics are being amplified around this case even after the verdict. Win, lose or draw, some people just want to deepen the divide. Look at these Black Lives Matter protesters confronting white diners in New York.
We don't want you here.
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 We don't want your money.
We don't want your money.
We don't want your taquerias. Owned by white men. Tip 30%.
Now, given all of this, there are those who don't accept the verdict of the court, arguing that activists and politicians had issued an overt threat to the court and the judicial process that was considering the Floyd case.
If we don't get what we want, we will riot, we will loot, we will send these people out like soldiers to destroy your neighborhoods. And that is exactly what has happened. That has been the determination of this trial. The media and the Democrats now have enough power to bully and to lie to and to create propaganda and to successfully win. And that is what happened. And they are celebrating that win today. This was not a fair trial.
Only one side.
No person can say this was a fair trial.
As I said, I won't second guess the judgment, but we've all seen the video and we know how Floyd's pleas for help were ignored by Derek Chauvin and the officers there. So that talk is inflammatory, surely. The jury has had its say, and there are also clear legal opinions like this one.
But here we had a living, breathing person that the jury was able to relate to every day, day after day, watching the trauma of what he went through, begging for air, begging to breathe. This was an emotional as well as an intellectual decision. And when I say that, make no mistake, the facts are solid on this verdict. This verdict will be upheld on appeal.
We've got to accept that judgment. The whole of the United States has to accept that judgment, that justice has been done. Appeals will test these issues undoubtedly. But this has got to be a warning. Whether it's happened this time or not, we've seen the potential. We've seen the very real threat of mob violence if a verdict doesn't go the way of the mob. If mob anger, mob opinion, whipped up by media and politicians, plays into the justice system, we all lose. The justice system will be finished. We've had a taste of this in Australia in the past with Lindy Chamberlain and George Pell. In America right now, it's far more incendiary and deeply worrying.